Sheriff Blake Hansen wasn't a man to scare easily. 25 years on the force in Deer Hollow, Montana, had shown him just about everything. Domestic disputes that turned bloody, missing hikers found dead at the base of ravines, even the occasional cult activity when the seasons turned strange. But nothing had prepared him for the Johnson Ridge case. It began on a frost-bitten morning in mid-December. The call came in just after a.m. Maggie Turnbull, a local schoolteacher, had spotted something unusual while driving past the old Rayner property, a sprawling farmhouse that had been abandoned for decades. She claimed she'd seen a man nailed to the barn door. Sheriff Hansen dismissed it as hysteria. Probably a Halloween prank someone forgot to take down, he muttered to Deputy Carla Rourke as they loaded up the cruiser. But when they arrived, the truth was far grimmer than Hansen could have anticipated. The farmhouse loomed against the bruised purple sky, a shadowed monument to decay. The barn door hung ajar, the wood warped and swollen with years of neglect. But Maggie hadn't been lying. The body of a man late 30s, dressed in work boots and flannel, was affixed to the door with jagged steel spikes. His arms were spread wide, his head lolled forward like a grotesque marionette. Around him, symbols carved deep into the wood gleamed crimson, the fresh blood stark against the weathered planks. "Dear God," Carla whispered, her breath plumbing in the icy air. Sheriff Hansen didn't respond. His gut churned as he scanned the scene. This wasn't just a murder. It was a statement. By the time the coroner arrived and the scene was cordoned off, rumors had already started to spread. Small-town gossip travels fast, and before Hansen could finish his first cup of stale coffee back at the station, the phone lines were ablaze with theories. Some whispered about cults. Others insisted it was the work of the Wendigo, an old legend in these parts. Hansen wasn't a superstitious man, but something about the scene unsettled him deeply. The victim's expression, it wasn't one of pain or terror. It was empty, almost peaceful. As the sheriff sat at his desk that night, poring over crime scene photos and autopsy reports, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were dealing with something far beyond the usual. A case that would haunt him long after it was closed. The first 48 hours were chaos. Sheriff Hansen knew that any chance of solving this case lay in how quickly he and his team could piece together the clues. But from the start, the Johnson Ridge murder refused to play by the rules. The victim was identified as Thomas "Tommy" Greer, a drifter who had come through Deer Hollow only a few months prior. He was known to pick up odd jobs around town hauling lumber, repairing fences, but had no family, no close friends, and no apparent enemies. Deputy Rourke pieced together what little background they could from local chatter. Tommy had been staying in the run-down Sparrow Motel on the edge of town, a spot notorious for its transient clientele. The motel's owner, a weary, sunken-eyed man named Cliff Beringer, wasn't much help. Tommy was quiet, Cliff said, rubbing at a patch of grease on his shirt. Paid cash, kept to himself. Ain't seen him since Tuesday night. Did he seem scared? Nervous? Hansen pressed, his pen poised over a notepad. No, Cliff said, scratching his chin. Just off. Had this look in his eye, like he knew something the rest of us didn't. That single phrase stuck with Hansen, but it was what Deputy Rourke found in Tommy's motel room that deepened the mystery. The walls were covered in drawings, hundreds of them, scrawled in charcoal and ink. Most were incomprehensible scribbles, but some depicted symbols eerily similar to the ones carved into the barn door. Cult activity? Carla suggested, holding up one of the sheets, her gloved hand trembling slightly. Maybe, Hansen said, though he wasn't convinced. By the third day, a picture began to form, albeit a distorted one. Tommy had been spotted arguing with two locals just days before his death. The town's eccentric historian, Evelyn Evie Draper, and a reclusive logger named Seth Collins. Evie Draper had been a fixture in Deer Hollow for decades. Her cluttered home, stuffed with books and artifacts from the region's past, was practically a museum. She claimed to have been researching the ancient practices of the Bitterroot tribes, but her interest had earned her a reputation as a crackpot. Seth Collins, on the other hand, was as unsocial as a man could get. He lived in a cabin deep in the woods, emerging only to buy supplies. The locals whispered that Seth had a violent streak, though no one could ever prove it. When Hansen interviewed Evie, she spoke in riddles. Tommy was touched, she said, her eyes wide and distant. He saw things, felt things. The symbols? They're not from any cult I know of. They're older. Far older. What about the argument? Hansen asked, leaning forward. Evie hesitated, then said, "He came to me, said he was hearing whispers. Said they were coming from the woods near Johnson Ridge. He was desperate. Begged me to tell him what the symbols meant. When I couldn't, he got angry. Accused me of hiding the truth." Seth Collins was less forthcoming. "Didn't know the guy," Seth growled, standing in his doorway like a wall of muscle and flannel. Witnesses had placed Seth near the Rayner property the night Tommy was murdered, but Seth shrugged off the implication. "I work those woods," he said. "If I didn't come near the damn barn, I wouldn't have a paycheck. But killing a man? That ain't me." Hansen's gut told him there was more to Seth's story, but without hard evidence, he couldn't press further. Back at the station, the team pieced together a list of suspects and motives. Evie Draper, obsessed with the symbols and local folklore. Seth Collins, a man with a known temper and proximity to the crime scene. And perhaps most unsettling, the woods themselves. "It's like the damn forest has eyes," Deputy Rourke muttered late one evening, staring at the crime scene photos. Hansen didn't respond. He was thinking the same thing, but the break in the case wouldn't come from any of their suspects. It came from something much darker, something Hansen could never have anticipated. It was late, the kind of late that blurs the edges of the world. Sheriff Hansen sat alone in his office, the only light a dim desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The crime scene photos were spread across his desk like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't make sense of. His exhaustion was a physical weight pressing down on him. The phone rang, sharp and loud, cutting through the quiet. It was Deputy Rourke, her voice breathless. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "We've got another one." Hansen's stomach dropped. The scene was almost identical. A man, late 20s this time, nailed to a tree deep in the forest near Johnson Ridge. The same symbols carved into the bark around him. The same eerie serenity on the victim's face. The victim was identified as Danny Jorgensen, a part-time mechanic who'd grown up in Deer Hollow. Unlike Tommy Greer, Danny had deep roots in the town family, friends, a girlfriend who swore he'd been acting weird for weeks before his disappearance. Weird how? Hansen asked, jotting down notes as the young woman, barely holding it together, twisted her hands in her lap. He kept saying he was hearing things, she said, her voice trembling. Voices. Whispering at night. I thought he was. Yikno losing it. He started drawing these symbols over and over. And then she broke off, her tears spilling over. And then he said something was coming for him. The sheriff stared at her, the hair on his arms rising. The parallels between Danny and Tommy were undeniable. That night, Hansen combed through the files again, searching for anything he might have missed. And then he found it, a crude map sketched on one of the sheets taken from Tommy's motel room. It marked a specific spot in the woods, a place neither Hansen nor his deputies had noticed before. Johnson Ridge, he muttered to himself. The following morning, Hansen and Deputy Rourke headed out, the frost crunching beneath their boots. The map led them deep into the woods, where the sunlight barely pierced the dense canopy above. When they reached the marked spot, Hansen stopped cold. It was a clearing eerily quiet, the air heavy with a metallic tang that made his skin crawl. In the center was a stone altar, weathered and cracked, covered in the same symbols found at the crime scenes. Surrounding the altar were dozens of small animal bones, arranged in spirals that seemed to pulse with a strange energy. "What the hell is this?" Rourke whispered, her voice trembling. Before Hansen could answer, they heard it. A whisper. It started as a faint murmur, almost like the wind through the trees. But it grew louder, more distinct. Dozens of voices overlapping, speaking in a language neither of them recognized. "Sheriff, we need to go," Rourke said, backing away. Her hand was on her holstered gun, though Hansen doubted a weapon would do any good here. But Hansen stood frozen, his eyes locked on the altar. Something caught his attention, a piece of cloth snagged on the edge of the stone. He pulled it free, his stomach churning when he realized it was part of a jacket. Danny Jorgensen's jacket. And then he saw the tracks. Human footprints, leading away from the altar, deeper into the woods. Hansen and Rourke followed them, their hearts pounding. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they reached a small cave hidden by a tangle of roots. Inside, they found what they hadn't dared to hope for. A man, alive. He was curled in the corner, trembling, his hands over his ears. His clothes were torn, his skin scraped and bruised. When Hansen knelt beside him, the man looked up, his eyes wild with terror. "They won't stop," he whispered. "They're always there, watching, whispering." "Who?" Hansen demanded. "Who's watching?" The man opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, a sound ripped through the cave, a low, guttural growl that froze the blood in Hansen's veins. "Sheriff," Rourke said, her voice barely audible. "We need to get out of here." Now they dragged the man out of the cave, the whispers chasing them all the way back to their cruiser. Hansen didn't look back, but he felt it, the weight of something ancient and malevolent watching from the shadows. That night, back at the station, Hansen realized the case wasn't just about a killer. It was about something older than the town itself. Something that had been waiting, and it had just begun. Sheriff Hansen couldn't sleep. The whispers from the cave had stayed with him, like a shadow pressing against the edges of his mind. The man they'd found, Noah Caldwell, was barely coherent, shaking violently as he recounted what he could remember. "They come at night," Noah muttered from his cot in the holding cell. His voice was barely above a whisper. "They don't walk. They just appear. They talk, but not with words. They promise things. Horrible things. What kind of things?" Hansen asked, leaning in. Noah's bloodshot eyes met his. "They told me to bring them someone. A sacrifice. They said it would make the whispers stop." Hansen's stomach churned. Noah wasn't making much sense, but his words brought a chilling clarity to the case. The symbols, the grotesque murders, the strange altar in the woods, this wasn't just about human evil. There was something primal and ancient lurking in the shadows of Johnson Ridge. Deputy Rourke found the connection the next morning. She'd been digging through old records and stumbled upon something buried in the archives, a series of unsolved murders from the late 1800s. The details were eerily similar: bodies nailed to trees, strange symbols carved nearby, and whispers of cult activity in the woods. They called it the Offering, Rourke said, sliding the brittle, yellowed documents across Hansen's desk. Back then, the locals blamed it on a group of settlers who'd gone mad. But now, she hesitated. I don't think it's people doing this, Sheriff. Not entirely. The town was growing restless. Rumors of a curse spread like wildfire, and Hansen knew he had to act. But he also knew the truth wouldn't comfort anyone. That evening, he returned to Seth Cullen's cabin. Something about the logger still didn't sit right with him, and Hansen's gut rarely steered him wrong. Back again? Seth said, leaning against his doorframe, an axe slung over his shoulder. I told you, I don't know nothing about those murders. Hansen stepped closer, his hand resting lightly on the grip of his holstered gun. You've been out by Johnson Ridge a lot, Seth. Too much for someone who claims they don't know anything. Seth's eyes narrowed. I work those woods, and the altar? Hansen pressed. You just work around that too? Seth's expression flickered just for a moment, but it was enough. You've seen it, Hansen said, his voice low. And you've heard them, haven't you? The whispers. Seth's grip on the axe tightened. For a moment, Hansen thought he might lunge. But then Seth sighed, his shoulders sagging. They don't stop, he muttered. Not once you hear them. They get inside your head. Make you see things. Make you do things. What did they make you do, Seth? Hansen asked, his voice steady. Seth didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked into his cabin, leaving the door open. Hansen followed cautiously, his heart pounding. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and smoke. On the far wall, a row of crude carvings caught Hansen's eye symbols, the same ones from the barn and the crime scenes. Beneath them, something glinted in the dim light. A box. Hansen opened it, his breath hitching. Inside were bloodied nails, a hammer, and scraps of fabric pieces of clothing that matched what the victims had been wearing. You don't understand, Seth said from behind him, his voice trembling. It wasn't me. It was them. They said if I didn't do it, they'd take me instead. Hansen turned slowly, his hand gripping his gun. You killed them, Seth. I had no choice. Seth shouted, his voice breaking. They don't let you say no, they. A sound interrupted him, low and guttural, rising from the forest beyond the cabin. It wasn't a growl, not exactly. It was deeper, older, something that made the walls of the cabin seem to vibrate. Seth froze, his face pale. They're here, he whispered. Before Hansen could react, the windows shattered inward, and the whispers flooded the room. Seth screamed, dropping to his knees, his hands clawing at his ears. Hansen didn't wait. He grabbed Seth and dragged him outside, the two of them stumbling into the cold night air. The sound followed them, a deafening cacophony of voices, but the forest remained still, unnervingly still. Rourke and backup arrived moments later, the flashing lights of their cruisers cutting through the darkness. Hansen handed Seth over, his mind racing. It's not over, Seth mumbled as they hauled him into the back of a cruiser. You'll see. It's never over. The case closed with Seth's arrest. The evidence was undeniable, and the town finally breathed a collective sigh of relief. But Hansen couldn't shake the feeling that they'd only scratched the surface. The whispers had quieted. For now. Sheriff Hansen sat on the porch of his home, a mug of black coffee cradled in his hands. The sun was rising over Deer Hollow, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. But Hansen's thoughts were far from tranquil. The town was trying to move on. Seth Cullens had been arraigned for the murders, and most folks were satisfied with the explanation, a desperate man driven mad by isolation and a touch of superstition. The newspapers painted Hansen as a hero, the steadfast lawman who brought justice to a terrified community. But Hansen knew better. The nights were the worst. The whispers weren't gone. They came softly at first, a barely perceptible hum at the edge of his hearing. But as the hours dragged on, they grew louder, more insistent, until Hansen had to leave his bed and drown them out with the sound of the television or the hum of an old fan. He hadn't told anyone. Not Rourke, not the mayor, not even his ex-wife, who had called to congratulate him on his big win. The truth was simple. He was afraid. Not just for himself, but for the town. For the people he had sworn to protect. The woods still loomed on the edge of Deer Hollow, dark and impenetrable. The altar was still there too. Hansen had ordered it destroyed, but when the deputies went to check, it was gone. Vanished as though it had never existed. And Seth Cullens. He'd hung himself in his cell 3 days after his arrest, leaving behind a single message scratched into the wall. They never stopped. Hansen thought about Noah Caldwell, the man they'd pulled from the cave. He was in a state hospital now, catatonic, staring at nothing. The doctors said it was trauma, but Hansen suspected something worse. He took a long sip of his coffee, the bitter warmth grounding him for a moment. Then his radio crackled to life. Sheriff, Rourke's voice came through, tight and uneasy. "We've got a call. A couple hikers reported something out by the ridge." "What kind of something?" Hansen asked, though he already knew the answer. "They're saying they found another body," Rourke said. "Looks like the others." Hansen closed his eyes. The whispers rose in his ears, louder now, almost triumphant. He set the coffee mug down carefully, stood, and grabbed his hat from the hook by the door. "On my way," he said. As he walked to his cruiser, Hansen paused to glance toward the horizon. The woods were waiting, dark and endless, their secrets stretching back further than anyone could imagine. Justice, he realized, was never served. Not really. The whispers didn't care about guilt or innocence, law or order. They cared only about feeding, about keeping whatever ancient, malevolent force they served satisfied. He climbed into the cruiser, the engine rumbling to life beneath him. This case had left its mark, not just on the town, but on him too. A scar that would never fully heal. As he drove toward the ridge, Hansen thought about what Seth Cullens had said. It's never over, and deep down, he knew the truth of those words. Some evils couldn't be locked away or destroyed. Some evils were eternal. The woods whispered their welcome as he approached, and Hansen gripped the wheel tighter. He wasn't ready to listen. Not yet. But he wondered how much longer he could resist. Months later, winter had settled over Deer Hollow, burying the town under a thick blanket of snow. The forest, shrouded in frost and silence, seemed less menacing, its dark edges softened by the cold. The town had mostly moved on, as small towns often do. People whispered about the murders less and less, replacing the stories with more palatable gossip about school board elections and the upcoming spring fair. Sheriff Hansen was still hailed as the man who had saved them, though fewer folks brought it up in casual conversation. But Hansen wasn't the same. He'd started spending more time alone, his days consumed by work and his nights plagued by the whispers that never truly left him. His deputies noticed the change but didn't dare ask. Rourke tried once, after a particularly long shift, but he'd only shrugged her off. One evening, long after the station had closed, Hansen sat at his desk, staring at a faded photograph he'd found tucked away in the archives. It was from the late 1800s, the same era as the original offering murders. The photograph showed a group of settlers standing stiffly in front of a wooden cabin. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about it until Hansen's eyes fell on the background. There, among the trees, was the unmistakable outline of the altar. It was different, less weathered, but it was the same. The same symbols, the same strange energy radiating from the image itself. But it wasn't the altar that made Hansen's blood run cold. It was the shadow behind it. The figure was barely visible, more suggestion than substance, but it was there, tall, impossibly thin, with elongated limbs that stretched unnaturally into the trees. Its head tilted as if watching the settlers, its presence both subtle and overwhelming. Hansen dropped the photo, his heart hammering in his chest. The whispers started again, louder this time, urgent and insistent. He grabbed the bottle of whiskey from his desk drawer, poured himself a glass, and downed it in one go. Then came the knock at the door. It was soft at first, so faint, he thought he'd imagined it. But then it came again, louder, more deliberate. Hansen stood, his hand hovering near his holstered gun as he approached the door. When he opened it, the cold rushed in, biting at his face. No one was there. But in the snow just beyond the porch, a set of footprints led away from his house. Bare footprints. Human. They trailed off into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. Hansen stood there for a long time, staring into the void. The whispers were everywhere now, surrounding him, pulling him toward the forest like an invisible tide. He stepped back inside, shutting the door firmly behind him. For now, he would resist. For now, he would fight. But deep down, Hansen knew the truth. The woods were patient, and they were waiting.